A quick glance at a text in Japanese and Chinese will reveal obvious contrasts between the two. And this is not what this video is about. I'm not concerned with the differences in the kinds of scripts used in either language, and I'm not interested in differences between the simplifications applied to characters in Japan and China, although this could be a topic for another video. What I want to talk about today are subtle contrasts between forms of the same characters in both languages, which often get overlooked. Distinctions not significant enough to warrant encoding both forms as separate Unicode glyphs, but which only appear when you switch between fonts tailored to specific languages. If you've ever used any device or program in Japanese or Chinese, you may have noticed that sometimes some characters look a bit off. My phone's keyboard, for example, uses a Chinese font even if I type in Japanese. I thought it'd be interesting to summarize these differences in a video, so I looked through the Zoyo Kanji Hyo, which I had laying around on my desktop from my Hanjatsu Kanji videos, and tried to find some patterns that I could talk about. One thing I need to mention is that in China, as well as in Japan, some characters have been simplified, and these simplifications are not necessarily the same across both languages. So sometimes I will be comparing a Japanese character to a traditional Chinese character, sometimes to a simplified Chinese character, and sometimes I will have nothing to compare because a form used in one language doesn't exist in the other. Also, I won't be talking about literally every single difference because this video would be 2 hours long and very boring. I'll just go over some of the more conspicuous and commonly occurring ones. I also want to clarify I'm comparing general tendencies in print fonts, and some of these differences won't apply to brush calligraphy or handwriting. And even among print fonts, they're not all exactly the same. I'm going to start with things you'll see very often. One of them is a small vertical stroke, which in Japanese fonts is usually completely vertical, while in Chinese fonts it's slanted. However, when writing by hand, Japanese typically uses a slanted stroke as well. This will be a theme throughout the video. Chinese fonts tend to be closer to handwritten forms in both languages. Another such example is the radical for speech, which has a horizontal initial stroke in Japanese and a slanted one in Chinese. But again, the Japanese handwritten form is identical to the Chinese printed form. Speaking of slanting, this shape has a slanted top line in Chinese but a horizontal one in Japanese. This also affects the way you write the strokes, as it goes from right to left in Chinese and left to right in Japanese. However, this is only true for simplified Chinese, as traditional Chinese seems to be identical to the Japanese forms. We'll see other examples like that later. There's also this little bugger where it's the other way around. We have a horizontal stroke in Chinese and a slanted one in Japanese. And this, once again, affects the writing direction of the initial stroke. The same thing happens with these two characters. The radical for door is a little messy. It has 3 different forms for traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, and Japanese. All 3 of these characters actually have different encodings, which can't be said about other characters with this radical. The inconsistencies don't stop there. The handwritten Japanese forms, once again, resemble simplified Chinese print and handwritten forms, though I've seen these written with a horizontal stroke. That includes this character, meaning place. However, the simplified form of this character is actually identical to the traditional form, both in print and in handwriting. A similar case is this character, meaning now, which has a horizontal line in traditional Chinese and Japanese, but a slanted dot in simplified Chinese. The handwritten forms are consistent with the printed ones, but I have absolutely seen a dot used in Japanese handwriting too. Another element which is similar in Japanese and traditional Chinese, but different in simplified Chinese, is when you have 2 strokes like this. In traditional Chinese and Japanese, they are written as the radical for legs, and in simplified Chinese as the character for 8. Note that you can't apply this equivalence to all characters, as some contain the leg radical in all variants, and some contain the 8 radical in all variants. This shape also differs in simplified Chinese compared to the other 2. Containing a dot rather than a horizontal line. Also, there are some characters containing this element, which in simplified Chinese was modified to include a line at the top. I found 2 more examples of traditional Chinese agreeing with Japanese. In the character for demon, simplified Chinese saves a stroke by combining the vertical stroke inside the container with the sweeping stroke to the left. The same thing happens to the character meaning elephant. There are also examples in which Japanese differs from both simplified and traditional Chinese by separating an originally merged stroke into two. This is a result of Japanese kanji simplifications. In these cases, we have an extra stroke, but in return we gain consistency. I say that, but rarer characters which weren't deemed important enough to be simplified kind of ruin that. I mentioned that Chinese fonts are generally more consistent with handwriting, and here are more examples. For the character meaning enter, however, this is only true for simplified Chinese. The character for bone differs in Chinese and Japanese if you look at the top part. The little square within the bigger square is on the left in simplified Chinese and on the right in traditional Chinese and Japanese. The thread radical has 3 dots in Chinese and a longer vertical line in Japanese, at least when it's on the left side of the character. Otherwise, the Chinese version is more akin to the Japanese one, with minor differences including a hook on the bottom and the strokes in the top half which look more connected to each other. This last detail is more of a stylistic choice in Japanese fonts because in handwriting, again, the elements look the same way as in Chinese. In a similar vein, this element looks like it would be written with 2 strokes in Chinese and 3 in Japanese, but this is only the case in print as the handwritten forms are identical. A similar style can be found in some other characters, like those you can see on the screen now. This element has a different form in Chinese and Japanese fonts, but once again the difference collapses in handwriting. Likewise, the top stroke in this shape leans to different directions in either language, but this is also just a quirk of Japanese print fonts. If you take a closer look at this element, you'll notice that the final line which sweeps to the right extends further in Japanese than it does in Chinese. There are several shapes which in Chinese are written with a sharper angle than in Japanese. However, this only affects these elements in Chinese sometimes. Usually when they're placed on the left side of the character. In other positions they feature a smoother angle akin to that found in Japanese. This radical, meaning tooth, has an interesting inconsistency in Japanese. You can see that it actually takes 1 more stroke to write in Japanese compared to Chinese. However, when used as a standalone character, it's written the same way as in Chinese. Similarly, this element takes 3 strokes to write in Chinese, but 4 in Japanese. Moving on, this radical features an additional horizontal stroke in the Chinese version, and the vertical line beneath it extends further up. This similar radical is also affected by this change. This was actually a result of simplifications applied to Japanese characters, which is why rare characters which weren't simplified look like their Chinese counterparts. This will be another theme throughout the video. When Japanese orthography reforms took place, only characters found on the Joyo Kanjihyo, the list of about 2100 most common kanji, underwent simplifications. Rarer characters from outside the list were unaffected, so some elements aren't written consistently. There are a number of characters in which Chinese has an additional stroke that is missing in Japanese. Most commonly this happens when Chinese uses the character for dog with 4 strokes, while Japanese uses the character for big with 3. There are some other examples too, which you can see on the screen. Are there any examples of Japanese having an additional stroke compared to Chinese? Yes, there are. There are characters in which Chinese uses an element with 2 dots where its Japanese counterpart replaces it with a vertical line. But this is not always consistent. For example, the character itself, meaning mother, contains 2 strokes in the Japanese version as well. And some characters, like this one, actually have separate encoding. There's also this element, which in many Chinese characters features 2 dots instead of a horizontal line, which is not the case in Japanese. And once again, there are some characters in this set which are encoded separately. Both changes are a result of Japanese character simplifications, so in older Japanese texts you'll see variants similar to those found in Chinese. A similar thing happened to this element, which was changed in Japanese to this. There are also examples featuring a slightly different shape in Chinese, but these pairs have different Unicode values. This character, meaning straight, as well as other characters containing it, are different in both languages. The Chinese one looks like a bookshelf with 4 shelves, and the Japanese one like a bookshelf with 3 shelves suspended over a right angle. If this shape has legs at the bottom, the Japanese counterpart also has 3 shelves, but doesn't include the right angle. I've found one example where the two variants are not unified into one glyph, and also one whose Japanese version is the same as the Chinese one for some reason. There are also several characters in which this element is replaced with this one in Japanese. But these two are encoded separately because the Japanese version is an alternative variant form in Chinese. This change is another example of Japanese simplifications, and curiously it doesn't apply to this character. In a few characters with this shape, the Chinese version features 2 vertical strokes, whereas the Japanese one has a sweeping stroke and a hooked stroke. This only happens when this element is at the top of the character. In others, the Chinese form resembles the Japanese one. A similar thing happens to this element, in which the stroke on the left sweeps in Japanese but doesn't in Chinese. There are some characters in which this shape is replaced with this one due to Japanese character simplifications. The ship radical contains 2 dots in Chinese, whereas in Japanese the bottom dot is replaced with a vertical stroke. The tree element can be sometimes written with its roots detached from the trunk. There are cases in which that happens in Chinese, but not in Japanese, and sometimes only in traditional Chinese, though it's all font dependent. It can also happen the other way around, where the roots are detached in Japanese and joined in Chinese, at least in simplified Chinese. It's all kind of a mess. So these were most of the general differences between Chinese and Japanese typefaces. The differences I'll talk about now are more specific and only affect a handful of characters, so let's go through them real quick. These characters include this element, which in Japanese contains 2 dots instead of horizontal lines. From what I understand, this was because these elements were originally the character for a boat, but were changed in Chinese into the moon element. Some characters also underwent this change when kanji were simplified, but a few remained as they were. The character meaning wing replaces the final 2 strokes with horizontal lines in some Japanese characters, but others remain the same. A few characters with this element feature a hook in Chinese, but a straight line in Japanese. Some Japanese characters containing the radical for eating use a different, older form which was used before characters were simplified. The character meaning blade has 3 different variants with a different style for the final stroke. The character for horn is identical in Japanese and traditional Chinese, but has a longer vertical stroke in simplified Chinese. There are some characters in which 2 elements differ in Japanese and Chinese, at least simplified Chinese. This only affects characters which underwent simplification in Chinese, others are consistent across both languages. We're just left with differences which only affect 1 or 2 characters, so I won't talk through them, I'll just let the visuals do the work. So that's a general summary of the differences between Japanese and Chinese fonts. I don't claim that this video is exhaustive. There are many other minutiae which you can feel free to discuss in the comments. Keep in mind that this stuff is complicated. Sometimes, even within one character, traditional Chinese forms will differ from simplified Chinese forms, which will differ from Japanese forms, which will differ from Japanese forms from before kanji were simplified. And as I mentioned, not all fonts are the same. Not all print fonts, not all brush calligraphy, not all handwriting styles. Sometimes someone will write a character in a style that's not technically fully consistent with whatever language they're writing in because it just happens. You can even mess up the stroke order a little and they won't execute you, I promise.